Interoception, Neuroscience and Behaviour. How can we tell the difference between challenging behaviour that is deliberate and survival behaviour that is instinctive and uncontrollable? What assessments and observations or technology can we use to determine what is happening? Once we gain an understanding of the fight, flight, freeze imperative for children and young people, we can structure our skill teaching and responses to individual incidents. This session will give people the skills to evaluate behaviour and respond proactively and reactively in ways that de-escalate the situation.
Came up with a lovely hand model of the human brain. So let's kind of go through the hand model of the brain. And the wrist, the forearm coming up to here, is like your spinal cord. And right here at the end of the wrist is like the base of your skull. And here, the bottom of your palm, this is like the reptile brain, the life support system of the brain. So, you know, if the rest of your brain is wiped out through, say, for example, a stroke or a car accident, this life support part of your brain, the reptile brain, can still keep your body alive, can still keep all your organs functioning and your breath and your heart and so forth. And this is where a lot of autonomic nervous system operates and stems from this reptile brain. Now, above the reptile brain is the mammalian brain, often called the limbic brain or the emotional brain. So reptiles, they've got the fight or flight response, or they've got the freeze, shut down, flop and drop response, but they don't really have anything that is even remotely close to the complex emotional states that we see in mammals. And the limbic brain has many different parts to it, but two in particular that we'll be looking at in this course are the amygdala and the hippocampus. This kind of is the middle brain, the limbic brain, the mammalian brain, basically responsible for emotions. Now, on top of the limbic, mammalian, emotional brain, you've got the cerebral cortex, the thinking cap of the brain. The cerebral cortex is much thicker in mammals, but especially so in primates, and particularly so in human beings, more so than any other primate. And this cerebral cortex, the thinking part of the brain, responsible for consciousness and cognition. And right at the front of the cerebral cortex, you have the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's right up here at the front of your forehead, above your eyes. And particularly important to us is the medial prefrontal cortex, this bit in the middle, right at the front, this bit up here. This plays a very important role in mindfulness and awareness. So let's just go through it again. You've got your spinal cord, you've got your reptile brain. Underneath your cerebral cortex, you've got your mammalian brain with the amygdala and the hippocampus responsible for emotions. And then you've got your cerebral cortex, your thinking cap of the brain on top, and the medial prefrontal cortex right here in the center of the front, right there.
You have just been watching an excerpt from Dr. Russ Harris.
Awesome. So if you think about that with some person and their head on the top with their brain, when we talk about people losing it or having meltdowns or shutdowns, what we're talking about is them flipping their lid. So if you think about it, the brain's the wrong way around, thumb inside. When you flip your lid, the thumb automatically comes out. Okay, so that means none of the thinking parts are connected to the brainstem. The only part that's connected to the brainstem is the reptile part of the brain. So that's your survival instinct. Okay, does that make sense? So as soon as that lid goes completely and the thumb is out, there is no thinking, there is no conscious behaviour at that point. So the child in that state who trashes your room, that is purely a fight instinct behaviour. They are not doing it on purpose. They're not even conscious sometimes that they're doing it. So those kids that are really remorseful after they've done something terrible and they kind of look like they're not really sure what they did, they really are not sure what they did. They really didn't do it on purpose. So it's really important to understand that we are just a set of cells and electricity, and that we function differently depending on how the cells and the electricity are working. So what we want to be as humans is in homeostasis, which means balance. So we've got our nervous system, which is controlled by our reptile brain, and then we have our endocrine system, so that's all the chemicals. The nervous system is very short-term regulation, and our endocrine system is the long-term regulation. So one of the parts of our endocrine system is our thyroid. Now, if your thyroid doesn't work correctly, so they removed mine completely, so it doesn't work at all, or it might in someone's petri dish. That means that my endocrine system needs lots of chemicals from outside to regulate, and it's really hard to get that to work. Now, if yours works great, you'll be in homeostasis most of the time, but for our children and young people whose endocrine systems biologically don't work correctly for whatever reason, it's hard for them to be in balance. So it's both sides. But it's really important that both aspects work well. So, when we think about the nervous system, there are two sections to the autonomic nervous system. There's your parasympathetic and your sympathetic. And these were not named by someone on the spectrum, because sympathetic is actually the bit where you go into your survival instinct. So think S for survival, and parasympathetic is your rest and digest. Now, the two big words, acetylcholine and noradrenaline, those are the neurotransmitters, the chemicals that activate the cascade in that. And you cannot be getting stressed at the same time as getting into the state for rest and digest. You're only actively going into one state or the other. Does that make sense? Excellent. We're going to watch a video that makes that much clearer, okay? And again...
Within your nerve system is a branch called the autonomic nervous system. This is the component responsible for the regulation of subconscious bodily processes like breathing, reflexes, digestion, and organ function. The ANS can be divided into two branches: sympathetic, fight, fright, or flight, or parasympathetic, rest, digest, restore. We can experience instantaneous imbalance, or we can experience long-term compounding imbalances.
The sympathetic response ensured the survival of our species. If we're confronted with a life-threatening situation, our bodies will react by redirecting the blood and resources from the immune and digestive processes to our arms, legs, and brain so we can fight or flee. A shadow of this response is also triggered chronically by everyday things. Things like the daily commute, or money worries, or deadlines, or food choices, or the 100 emails you get a day, or the fact that there is just never enough time. All of these things are stresses, and they all add up to tip the balance of your ANS towards the draining sympathetic dominant state.
The parasympathetic response also ensured the survival of our species, for without it, we would not grow and regenerate or heal from taxing situations. When we are in a relaxed and safe place, our bodies have the ability to slip into a state that allows us to recover and restore. Prolonged parasympathetic dominance can find you staying too long in that slow and steady place, and that's when you may find yourself becoming lethargic, apathetic, or lacking a spring in your step.
Whatever our long-term stress is, whether it's that they live in poverty, or whether it's that they live with trauma, or whether it's that they have an auditory processing disorder, so they've struggled all their life to process and understand, whether it's that they've been mislabeled as having an intellectual disability when they don't, whatever those long-term stresses are, think of the hand model. When you're starting to get stressed, you start to go up, up, and start to flip your lid. And when you're completely stressed, you flip your lid, there's nothing thinking. Now they're arriving, if they have long-term stresses in their home life, they're arriving already opened. Okay? This is really, really important because they've still got some ability to think as long as that thumb is there. However, if that thumb has started to go out and they're not quite yet in survival mode, what happens when you speak to them is that you have just added in some input. And if you're in this position, any input comes in and that reptile is actually the only one thinking, the reptile goes, danger. And so they respond in their default position. And for some people that are very withdrawn, their default position is actually freeze, or as they said in that video, flop and drop. But it's actually that internalizing, so they fold in on themselves. The externalizers are the ones we tend to worry about, but actually the internalizers is just as bad for their mental health. In terms of their ability to stay out of jail, it's probably a lot better, but it's still very bad for their mental health. So, one of the things that's really important is if you're in this state all the time, you're not actually going to be experiencing feelings and emotions. You're just going to be electrochemically stimulated to be overloaded. We need to be in this position to be able to experience our feelings and emotions. However, for lots of people, they don't actually experience that properly. It's governed by the part of the brain called the insula. And what we know is that the insula regulates, or is the awareness and accuracy of interoception. We also know that for kids who experience trauma, whether this is long-term or short-term trauma, that insula is impacted. If you yourself have ever been in trauma, you know that it is a protective mechanism for your brain that you don't feel it properly. So for many people, if they're in a car accident, the adrenaline kicks in and they don't actually feel the pain. And we know that's protective, we know that's a good thing. But for our young people that live in trauma on a daily basis or for a very long time, what happens is that insula isn't just stopping that immediate thing of that doesn't hurt that second. What it's doing is it's actually stopping working properly at all. So they're not feeling full stop. So interoception is, you can call it lots of different things. You can call it biofeedback, you can call it interoceptive awareness, you can call it mindful body awareness. This is broadly defined as that conscious perception of your internal self. So most of us sitting here are not aware of our heartbeat. But if we notice our heartbeat, that's your interoceptive awareness. Now, when most of us aren't thinking about our breathing, but if we notice our breathing, that is interoceptive. And we know that when we hyperventilate, for example, so when we flip our lid, often we start to hyperventilate. And we notice that, don't we? Now, for some of our young people, they don't notice any of those things. But all of your internal body signals, that is actually what makes up a feeling and emotion, because we are electrochemical beings. So we have an electrical signal or a chemical signal that says, oh, your heart's beating faster, and your brain processes that with other body signals to say, oh, well, this must be what you're feeling, and then we'll respond to that. And we know, like I said, interoception is not typical in individuals who've experienced trauma, but we also know there's been a lot of research around autism and interoception, and it's atypical in nearly all people on the spectrum. We also, from our work in South Australia, have discovered that interoception is atypical in children and young people who've got mental or physical health issues, but also if they have less than optimal parenting. Now, this is really important. You need a parent to actually scaffold your interoception. So we know from the 1970s and 80s where we had children in Romanian orphanages and they didn't develop language. And they didn't develop all these physical skills as well. There wasn't actually anything wrong with them, they just hadn't had any interactions. You actually need human interactions to develop your interoception. I want you to think about being toilet trained. Now, when you were little and you were getting toilet trained by mum at home or nan or whoever, they would say, if you're a girl, you're wiggling. You need to go to the toilet. If you're a boy, you're clutching. You need to go to the toilet. Over time, what you do is you notice your body. So you notice just as you're wiggling, the muscles here feel a bit tighter and the bit inside might feel a bit fuller. And you're experiencing that fullness in the bladder and the way that it pushes against the muscle walls here. Now, if you don't have that, how do you know? So you get to school or kindy and they tell you when to go to the toilet, but you might not have an urge and you don't actually know what that urge feels like because you've never got those pre-signals. So it's really important that we understand the role that optimal parenting plays in this. Now, if you as a parent don't have interoception, how do you then develop that in your child? Same way, if you don't have language, how do you develop language in your child? So there are kind of two parts to interoception. There's proprioception, which is your sense of body in space. And so that's the signal from your skin and your musculoskeletal system. So if I put my arm out here, I tend to know how long my arm is. Actually, I personally don't, but most people do. And therefore they can pick things up accurately, they can put things down, they can walk through spaces. Now, your children that don't have good proprioception, those are the children that trip over things, walk into people, drop things repeatedly, because if they're putting their drink bottle down and they don't have a good sense of their body in space, they will drop it from here because they think it's here on the table. They're not deliberately doing this, their brain is not processing the signals correctly. And the other one is visceroception, which is the signals from your inner organs. So like your heart and your lungs and your muscles. Okay, does that make sense? Excellent. All the other senses are extra perception, so your sight and your smell. If you feel very threatened or very anxious, what happens is your reptile brain has to be the one that comes to the fore. So everything else goes like this, and your sympathetic nervous system takes over and takes you into survival mode. Now this is really, really useful. If you get out of your car and there is a big dangerous snake just there, you don't want to be thinking. Because if you're thinking, that time it takes to think is all it takes for the snake to go and oops, that was the wrong thing you thought. So you want survival instinct to kick in. You want to either run very fast, freeze so the snake doesn't see you, or hide by shutting the door. Or fight, you're super brilliant, you happen to have a spade in your hand and you happen to be able to chop its head off. Okay? And the default for you is what your default is. So we all have a different default. Now I am the biggest wuss ever, my default is hide. And I know this is true. I've had quite a bit of trauma in my life and I always hide. And when we had the earthquakes, I'm from Christchurch in New Zealand, I hid under the bed. Really silly idea, if the house is going to fall down, the bed is not going to save me, but you know, that's what my sympathetic nervous system told me to do. Now whatever your student's default is, if you interact with them at that point, the reptile says, even more danger, this strategy is not working, we need the next one up. What is the highest hierarchy in the survival instinct strategy set? Fight. So whatever their default is, if you go closer to them, if you keep talking to them, if something happens, they will go into fight. So if you have a child who is a runner, and that is their sympathetic nervous system overload default, if you chase them, you will get injured or somebody will get hurt. Okay? So you have to have a plan that respects what their default is. You can't change it, that's hardwired in, that's reptile brained in. Okay? But what you can do is respond in a safe way. Which brings us back to your children. So your young people are arriving at school with reptile brain engaged and nothing else. What we need to do is get that lid closed before talking to them. So what you would want to do is set up a way for them to do that, which we know we can do through the interoception activities. So you would want, during the day when they are okay, to train them to do that, and that there's a prompt set up in the mornings that they just do it. And nobody's interacting with them until they're like this. Okay, and that is the case, sadly, for quite a number of our young people around the state. Okay, we're going to watch a short video now, which is from the US, and this is about the impact of trauma. And it's really important that you watch this with the hand model of the brain in mind.
Our brains are designed to help us survive by making sure we make danger a priority. This is done by the various parts of the brain, called the amygdala, thalamus, hippocampus, cerebellum, prefrontal cortex, full frontal cortex, the pituitary, and the flux capacitor. Got that? Okay, so basically the fear response begins with input from your senses. Together they create an emotional response. For fear, the response is typically fight, flight, or freeze. After emotional events, situations, or feelings, you begin to learn what situations are safe or dangerous. You also begin to develop quick action plans in these events. But this isn't what always happens to someone who has dealt with trauma. They are not able to develop action plans in situations and can't quickly tell if the situation is safe or dangerous, leaving them in a constant state of alert and feel like they are in danger. Think of a youth that tends to overreact. Say a boy trips and bumps into him. The youth turns around, ready to fight, and punches the kid. He felt like he was in danger and never stopped to think that it might be an accident. In adolescence, trauma can interfere with development of the areas of the brain that are responsible for consideration of the consequences of behavior, for realistic appraisal of danger and safety, and the ability to govern behavior and meet longer-term goals. And as a result, are at an increased risk for reckless and risk-taking behavior, underachievement and school failure, for poor choices, and aggressive or delinquent activity.
So if you think about it, if they're permanently in this state, can they consider choices? No. So are they actually actively engaging in risk-taking behaviour? No. They're just constantly in survival mode. So it looks like they're making poor choices. They're not making any choices. Okay, so it's really important that we understand that. And this happens, unfortunately, in our kindies and our primary schools as well as our high schools. Okay? And the students, quite often, if we don't know that there is trauma, we don't know that there are long-term stresses, we assume that they are naughty. We assume that it's poor parenting. But we don't always know the circumstances of a child's life, and it's really important that we don't make assumptions about their lives, but we look at the evidence in front of us. So if our Insta is working well, and we have good interoception, then yes, behaviour is a response, and behaviour can be analysed and looked at the meaning behind it. So what happens in that case is we get the internal body signals. We're like, okay, yep, this bit's like that bit's like that. Oh, I'm feeling quite calm. Okay, that's good, right? So I'll respond in this way. And if I'm thinking, okay, actually, I'm feeling a bit stressed and a bit anxious because I have a phobia about turquoise water bottles, and I can see one, and I'm going to get really, really anxious and stressed. But it's okay because it's over there, it's not going to get me. So I can stop and I can think that through. If my interoception is working well, my Insta is working well, I know before it gets to here, I can feel it going like this. Okay, so I can feel that sympathetic nervous system arcing up. And we process it and we can do something about it. So if you don't know you're getting angry, so you're getting angry, you're starting to go like this, and you don't know what's going to happen, you keep going and keep going until you're at this point. And this is all those children and students that you've worked with that go from 0 to 100 like that. That's what's happened. They're not going from 0 to 100 like that. They're going like this, but they don't know they're doing it, so you don't know they're doing it until it's too late. So every child that you think is trigger happy, that's really the case. It's just that they don't know, so they can't show it, so you don't know. Does that make sense? Excellent. So, unfortunately, with those children and students that don't know it, they're not also accurately assessing their environment. Because there's nothing inherently scary about a turquoise water bottle. However, it might be that 3 years ago, a turquoise water bottle hurt me. And so we have to also understand that people are processing things that are not relevant to the here and now. So they might have learned that a cat is very dangerous rather than learning that the bear is very dangerous. Does that make sense? And also if they're in this state, almost completely flip their lid, pretty much everything that's coming in is perceived as danger. It's really hard to get it back to this state with interactions. So those kids that are on high alert, highly strung children, highly anxious children, what they are is they're in sympathetic nervous system. They're almost always just before overload. So we're just about to explode or implode. Okay? Does this help you to understand some of the kids you've been working with? And are you thinking, oh, I wish I'd known that? Because that's what I felt like when I first learned about this stuff. I was like, this is so important. Because when we know this, it changes everything, doesn't it? We can't work with those kids in the same way that we've been working with them. So we're going back to my electrochemical bodies, and I want you to think about how we interpret our personal body signals as emotions and feelings. So we're thinking about things like pulse rate, quality of pulse, breathing rate, quality of breathing, your muscle and tendon placement and tension. So if my arm is out like this and my hand is up like that, I've got tension along here. Okay, if it's placed like that, the tension is not there anymore. Hunger, thirst, body temperature. Now it can be quite weird to think that somebody doesn't have awareness of body temperature or of thirst or hunger. However, how many of you have had kids go out in 40-degree heat with their sweater on? And you say to them, aren't you hot? And what do they say? No, because they are not feeling hot. They do not have interoceptive awareness of temperature. Now what happens in that case is they put their sweater on, right? They're outside in the heat, and what happens to their body temperature? It goes up and it goes up, and at some point they have to do this because their brain is getting stressed. Yes?
A lot of kids don't seem to be aware of the cold.
That's another interoceptive awareness, absolutely. Yep, so those kids will be wearing a t-shirt when it's freezing, and their hands will be going blue, and their feet will be going blue, sometimes even their lips are going blue, and they have no idea. And you say to them, aren't you cold? But jump on, not cold. Both cases, what happens is the brain gets stressed. So the sympathetic nervous system chemicals get activated because our body needs to be in homeostasis, it needs to be in balance. And we need to have a particular core temperature. There's a little bit of wiggle room on either side, but generally when you're hot, what do? Drink water, take some outer layers off. If you're cold, what do? Clothes on. You might drink a hot drink, have a hot water bottle, wrap yourself up, have a hot shower. For our kids that don't have that interoceptive awareness of temperature, they're doing nothing, so they're making it worse consistently. So it actually affects so much interoception. It's not just obvious things like they're not knowing that they're getting angry, so they get into rage. It's that they don't know they're getting hot, so they overheat. They don't know they're getting cold, so their body gets too cold. Now, our body has an interesting mechanism. When it gets to the point that you really are about to be life-threatened, your body will shiver, and shivering generates heat. But they don't know it till that point, until the biological necessity kicks in, and sometimes not even then. One of the other aspects of interoception is what's called air hunger. How many of you have swum underwater? Quite a lot? How long can you stay swimming underwater for? Until what happens?
Well, I consciously want to get back to
okay.
the surface.
You want to go back to the surface. Why? To breathe. How many of you feel the need to breathe when you're underwater? Okay, how many of you don't? Okay, now I'm on the autism spectrum and I don't have air hunger. What that means is if I swim underwater, I have to be taught to bring my head up to breathe. The number of children on the autism spectrum who drown versus children not on the autism spectrum drowning is quite astounding. And it wasn't known previously that air hunger was not hardwired into everyone. So when they discovered this, they've actually started going back and looking back at the drowning deaths to see if there were any indications that those children didn't have air hunger. Okay, so it is a fundamental. If you take your kids swimming and you've got kids that you think have trauma or autism or any other reason to not have good interoception, don't assume they have air hunger. Teach them. I know that swimming instructors might not know this. I haven't talked to them. So, my example was my throat is tight, my chest is tight, and my hands are clammy. What emotion do you think I would be feeling at that time? Okay, anxious or fear? Okay, good. Now, what you're going to do is in pairs, you're going to, or if you're a three, somebody will do it and the other two will listen. What I want you to do is one person is going to describe their body state. You can do it not now, you can do it at for any emotion that you have that you can describe, and the other people have to guess it. Okay, you have about 30 seconds to do this. You are not allowed to use words like tired, okay, because that's a feeling, isn't it? Okay, you're also not allowed to say things like it was when I got a parking ticket, because that's cheating. Okay, so you're just describing your body state.
So it started with my face was hot and red, and my arms were shaky, and then my whole body was hot.
Oh, interesting. And did they guess your emotional feeling correct?
No, because we then started discussing that so those signals in my body is somebody else's, is a different emotion than somebody else.
Yes! Fantastic!
A for us.
A for you. You all have imaginary chocolate frogs. That is a really important point, because what we often do is we assume that the way we express emotion is the way that other people express emotion. Now, most of us are kind of aware that it's socio-cultural as well. So I live next door to a Chinese family on one side and an Italian family on the other. They do not express themselves the same. Okay? My partner is Kiwi and I'm British. We do not express ourselves the same. However, as a teacher, we just think, oh yeah, everybody in my class is the same as me. And that's because we know how we feel if we have good interoception. I'm really interested, what was your feeling or emotion? Because I have no idea.
Angry.
Ooh, how interesting. Now, if we just took my face is hot, so if you had a little bit of interoceptive awareness, but not a lot, you might get one body signal. Now, if you knew your face was hot, could that be one emotion or quite a lot of emotions like this? Quite a lot. So that's also a problem. And we notice that in children and young people who say, I'm bored all the time. When you know for sure they're not actually bored. What they mean is, my body feels a little bit different from homeostasis, but I have no idea exactly what different it is. So often what happens with children when they're quite little is the fact that parents will, a carer or somebody will say to them at some point, you're bored, and they know their body feels different. So at that moment, every time their body feels different, they're bored. We also get people who say they're angry all the time, and that's again been imposed on them as a label, and they assume that that is for every time their body is not in homeostasis, they're angry. So it's really important when we get children that we think, oh actually, your interoception isn't that great, that when they are using those kinds of emotion and feeling words, that we take it with a grain of salt. That we go, okay, they're not in homeostasis, but they may not actually know what they're feeling like. So let's dig into this a little bit more. Let's look at the context around it. Does that bored mean frustrated? Does it mean happy? Does it mean sad? Does it mean angry? Okay? And we also know that emotions, that we tend to think of positive emotions and negative emotions, but actually what happens to that toddler when they're overexcited? Do they stay, is it staying a positive emotion? No. What about you yourself? If you get to the point where you're just so positive about something, and you keep being, and it keeps happening, does it stay like that forever? No. And a negative emotion, by the same thing, if we're angry, does it always stay like that? And sometimes does that anger turn into positivity because we've used the anger to drive change, to do different things. So using them as negative and positive emotions is not always helpful. We need to be thinking about strong emotions and less obvious emotions. So the problem for our children with weak interoception is that they don't notice an emotion until it's banging them on the head. And usually the emotions that bang you on the head are almost here. Okay, and that's why they're banging you on the head, is because the reptile's woken up and going, hey. So when we get back to interoception, this is my favourite triangle, I love this triangle. We need to be understanding there are three core parts to having enough interoception to be able to self-manage and self-regulate. The primary that you can't do anything else without is the awareness of your internal body states. So if the lion can't feel the thumpy heart, the sweaty palms, or the feeling when they need to go to the toilet, or the wobbly knees, or the butterfly in their tummy, or goosebumps, or tears, they are not ever going to be able to self-regulate. So when you have a highly traumatised child whose insular is turned off, They are not going to be able to self-regulate until we wake the insert up again. Okay, which you can do with the interoception curriculum. The second part of that is your awareness of feelings and emotions. So we'll take your red face and your shaky arms. We have to put those two together. So I have to have an awareness of several different things. An emotional feeling is always a collection of at least two things in your body. Okay? Because if it was just red face, well, it could be I'm embarrassed, it could be I'm hot, it could be I've got sunburn. If it was just shaky arms, it could be I've been carrying something too heavy, it could be tired, it could be all kinds of things. It's the collection of those things together that make up a particular emotional feeling. And then we need to have that awareness of the impact of outside things on our internal self. So again, with the children that go out in the heat, they actually don't even know that the heat impacts their internal body. So not only are they not aware of their own internal temperature, they're not aware that the outside temperature affects their internal temperature. So we can teach all those aspects separately, and altogether it makes up the interoception. Now it turns out that this is the least important one to teach. And yet, what we have focused on as educators for many, many years, and I myself have done this, teaching emotions. And yet, as you said, your emotion is different from your emotion. So how have we been teaching it? Like, I remember going out to work with a child on the spectrum, and I'd been given some emoticons to do with him, and I was supposed to teach him what all the emoticons meant. The problem was I didn't know what the emoticons meant, so we just spent the whole session guessing what the emoticons meant. But even if I knew that this emoticon meant frustrated, what does that feel like? What is the experience of frustration? What we have to understand is that if our interoception is different from somebody else's, so if somebody in your class has atypical interoception, their facial expressions will be different. They either won't match what they're feeling, or they're not feeling anything to have the facial expression for. And their body language will also be atypical. But also, their motor planning and their motor movements might be atypical. And communication, when we talk about speech, is actually about motor planning. So some of our young people who can talk sometimes and not other times, that is a really good indicator of their emotional state of being, that they're starting to get into this state, they're starting to have that sympathetic nervous system kick in, because their motor planning gets taken over by the reptile, and the reptile isn't interested in talking. The reptile is interested in survival. So you have then people who might think they look one way in terms of, I think I'm smiling at you, and all the resting bitchy face memes. You all know these? We might even know people that are like this. People say, why are you grumpy? But I'm really happy today. So my really excited face, which you will see later, looks just like this. Okay? But that's just the way it is. It doesn't make it wrong, but it makes it hard for you to observe. So it's little things that you're observing. It's little changes that you're observing. Now, one of the things you might be looking at is what we call internal regulation responses. So if you have somebody that cuts their hand and they suck the blood, that's a well-regulated response, isn't it? Okay? That is a typical thing to do. But if we have someone that's biting their hand and there wasn't any cut or anything, then we're thinking, okay, that's a dysregulated response to your internal self. But are they biting it because they can't feel anything in their hand normally? So could you imagine if you couldn't feel your hand? If suddenly you stopped feeling in your hand, what would you do?
Something with your hand, or you touch it.
Yeah.
Try and reconnect.
Try and reconnect your hand. So we have kids who are biting their hand to make their hand exist, to reconnect with their hand. But we also have children who feel so much in their hand, they're tactile defensive, they don't want to touch anything, because their hand is so super sensitive that it's almost painful. So again, that is a dysregulated response to your internal self. Make sense? Excellent. So, when we're thinking about interoception and emotions, you're thinking, okay, that part of our brain is interpreting the body signals and responding. But where it isn't interpreting the body signals, it's not able to respond. And so you get, instead of how do you feel, it's how do you feel? Like, how does one actually feel? So if I can't feel my hand, I'm going to bite my hand or hit something to make my hand feel. If I don't know whether I'm happy or sad, I can't respond as if I'm happy or sad. If I don't know that I'm in pain, I can't do anything about it. What we talk about is our embodied sense of self. So, when a baby is born, do they know they have hands? No. And what happens when babies know they have hands?
Stare at them.
Yeah, they can stare at them, and then what's the next thing they often do? In their mouth. Okay? So they're starting to develop a sense of self. And then they start to find other parts of their bodies, don't they? Feet. Okay? As children develop, typically they get what's called a complete embodied sense of self. So they know this is my body. My hands are on the ends of my arms, which are attached to my shoulders, which are attached to my torso. Oh, and there's these hips and legs and feet. Okay? For children that don't have good interoception, that embodied sense of self can be damaged, or if they never developed interoceptive awareness, they don't have that embodied sense of self at all. So that means we have children and young people, so children in high school, who don't actually feel present and there. So quite a number of crisis interventions that I've been asked to do relate to children who and young people who their schools are worried are self-harming. So I worked with a lovely young man, and he was hitting himself very hard on his chest on a daily basis, causing bruising, and the school were rightly very concerned. But when I met with this young man, he had no idea that was damaging his body. It was the only way he felt like he existed. So we also have children that will do things like slam into walls or hurl themselves at things. And where they have language, often might be years later, they're able to explain, I did that because it was the only way I felt. So where they don't have language, that would be a good assumption to make. Because if the assumption is they're self-harming, the treatment is quite different. Whereas if it's that they don't exist, we can teach them to exist. We can teach them to feel their body by teaching them to notice. And where we have children and young people who have physical disabilities, who can't do some of the things, it's that hand-over-hand system that OTs would use. So you might stretch their hand out with them, relax it again, and you're actually physically doing that with them, or the OT might be doing that with them. And that, as they're directed to notice it, they will start to feel it. And as they start to feel more and more bits of their body, that embodied sense of self starts to develop and the interoception starts to work correctly. The other things we often see is children who hit and kick. How many of you have got hitters or kickers? Yep, quite a few. Now, if I can't feel my hand that much, I'm not actually going to hit you, I'm just going to press you. If I did this and connected full force, oh wow, that's quite close. And the response that I had, you're thinking, wow, what a callous person. Not only did she hit, but then she looked quite pleased. Well, I look quite pleased because I exist. And the same with feet. If I don't feel my feet that much, just walking is not really giving me enough feedback. But if I kick something, oh, my feet exist. So we need to understand that a lot of what looks like violence and aggression that you can say is not sympathetic nervous system overload, you're very clear it isn't, is about existing. Okay? This gets complicated when we think about the fact that developmentally that makes you about 18 months old, and yet this person can read and write. They're 16. They're average academically. How can they be 18 months old developmentally in that area? You can. And it's really important that we understand that, and particularly when we think about trauma. So when we think about trauma, we've known for years that children who see, they don't even have to actually physically experience domestic violence, but who see domestic violence, their brain changes. And the insular-being effect is one of those changes. Their children are born with that brain change, regardless of whether or not they then experience or see anything traumatic. The only way to fix it and wake those parts of the brain up again is by engaging in activities that help them to notice themselves. Okay, so it's really important we understand fundamentally we can have 18-month-olds developmentally in terms of embodied sense of self. And that impacts the way that they manage themselves. And if they are internalizers, we can sometimes just not notice it. They're the quiet person who doesn't do a lot at the back. Where they're externalizers, we often can mislabel them as being naughty or attention-seeking. But actually they're just trying to exist. Okay. So what you want to do is daily observations. Now you do this anyway because you watch the kids come into your rooms, you watch them leave, you watch them while you're teaching. But there are a few key areas that you want to kind of watch that would tell you whether or not these children and young people have got good interoception. Now just like all your other senses, that you might have good hearing and poor eyesight. You can have good interoception for pain, but sucky interoception for muscle placement. You can have good interoception for your heart rate and sucky interoception for your breathing. Okay, so you can have generally sucky, generally brilliant, and everything in between. Make sense? Observations. Does that young person know before they need to go to the toilet, or do they only know when they need to go now? This is really obvious in a high school. Except if the child, young person, has decided never to eat and drink at school, so they don't have to go. Because they know that they won't get there in time. The implication of that is what in terms of learning?
She's dehydrated and the brain isn't functioning.
Exactly. So the children and young people that do that are impacting their learning because they're dehydrated and they can't learn optimally. It is really problematic. One of the things as an educator that you can do is make very clear to your children and young people at the beginning of every term, if you have to go to the toilet, you can go. Now you might not want to say that to the whole class because 6 of them who don't need to go will just go. But the young person that you think this might be an issue for, just let them know. Because you know before, probably. Many of you at the end of today will look at the time, judge the traffic, work out how long it's going to take to get home, and decide whether or not to go. If you're a person with very poor interoception, you don't go because you don't need to. You're stuck in the traffic and you've got to go. And that's a problem. And that's why many adults also stop eating and drinking, because they don't want to have that issue. So it's a really big thing. That thing around temperature is also really easy to observe. Have you got kids going out in sweaters in term 1? They probably don't have good interoceptive awareness for heat. You'd mark them down as possibly having other areas that aren't so flash either. Do they have poor proprioception? So do they bump into things? Do they drop things? Do they trip over other kids on the mat when there's a great big space just there? This is proprioception. So one of the worst things about proprioception is banging into door frames. I do this regularly. It's very frustrating. Believe me, if I didn't have to, I wouldn't. So your kids with poor proprioception, that is part of interoception. So you would then be thinking there are probably other areas that don't work so well. And do they respond atypically to touch or pain? So one of the things that most people know about kids on the spectrum is, okay, they can be a bit weird about touch. It's that their interoceptive awareness for pain is wired not quite right. So either the gentlest touch is excruciatingly painful, or they don't feel anything until you're almost squishing them. And then they're like, oh, that's quite nice. Because then they feel. So you get the whole gamut. So you'll be looking at your children and students that you've worked with, and these are the red flags. So they're kind of easy red flags. So does that help for your children who don't have language? Yeah, awesome. Now we're going to watch a little video now about the brain tricking us. Because one of the things that some people in the early days of this training said was, well, I kind of find it really hard to understand that other people are so different. Like, how can some people not feel these things? So we're going to look at how the brain can trick everybody. And then there's a part where he does an activity where you put both hands out together, and I want you to join in from that point, and I will tell you where you're going to wiggle. Okay?
Hand experience. I want you to put your left hand right here and put your right hand right here.
Jonah has participants hide their right hand out of sight behind a divider.
I'm just going to drape this as if it's your real hand.
While he places a rubber hand on the table in front of them.
Just stare at this hand.
Jonah primes participants by brushing both the fake and real hand simultaneously, a process which helps the brain link the feeling to the fake arm.
I feel like you're doing that to my hand, but that's not my hand. My hand's over there, so that's kind of weird.
That's kind of weird.
Now that Jonah has linked this volunteer's brain to the new hand, he's got an even bigger surprise for her.
That was a little bit scary.
Good plunge.
Oh my goodness. When you hit that thing, I thought I was gonna lose my hand. So that was so scary. And it really felt like that was like I could move those fingers if I wanted to. My brain decided that I could feel that. And that you hitting that was hitting me. That's so strange how it does that.
Impressive, right? Let's see how many other people fall prey to this mind game.
My name's Jonah. Okay, so you keep on staring at that hand.
That was crazy. That was crazy.
Okay.
Oh, wow. That scared me.
That scared you?
Although around 10% of the participants weren't able to mentally connect the fake hand to their body.
Did it feel like I smashed your hand at all? No.
Nope.
Most felt some kind of phantom sensation, if not actual pain. Jonah is hacking into these people's mental body maps, causing them to connect information inaccurately. This is something that's relatively easy to do at home. Play along with our actors in this one.
Okay, so try this. Put your hands out, cross them.
Remember this trick from when you were a kid? Place your hands in front of you, cross your arms, and place the face of your palms together with your thumbs down.
Fingers together and bring it up.
Link your fingers, and then twist your arms down and towards you.
There you go.
Now have someone else point to one of your fingers, or just pick one yourself and try to lift it.
That one there. There you go.
Did you move the right one? Try another. And another.
Wrong one. There you go.
Harder than you expected? Here, just like in the rubber hand trick, we disoriented your mental map of your body and caused many of you to mistake one hand for another.
Who found that a little bit hard? Excellent, that means you've got good embodied sense of self. Now, he says that 10% of people struggled with the fake hand to connect to it. Now, if you've got a good embodied sense of self, you know that your hand is at the end of your arm, right? So if you don't know that your hand is at the end of your arm, you're not going to have a problem with it. You cannot try that hammer experiment at school, by the way. So about 10% of the general population have poor interoception. So that matches up really interestingly with that 10% of people didn't connect to the fake hand. When you do the two hands together experiment, if you have got really poor embodied sense of self, it's actually easier than if you have good. Because if you have a good embodied sense of self, you're like, well, my left hand is at the end of my left arm. Whereas if you have poor interoceptive awareness, you have to, first of all, do an L to know that that's the leg. You have to start at your shoulder, go all the way down, and it doesn't matter that it's on this side. So the children that have less good interoception actually find that one easier than the kids with good interoception. You can do that part of it in your class. It's just not the one where you hit people with a hammer. But can you see how your brain could be tricked? Think about also people with phantom leg pain. So they've actually had an amputation, but they can still feel that. Again, your embodied sense of self is so strong when it develops typically that you know that your leg is here even when your leg is no longer there. It's really interesting. So generally what will typically happen is you're born as a baby, you don't have very good interoception in any, and you develop it and you get better and better and better until you're fabulous. And you have a great embodied sense of self which is really strong. However, it can always be impacted by trauma. Interoception can also always be improved. So it's not this static thing. So if we think about our eyesight, generally eyesight only goes one way, yeah? We're born with great eyesight and then it sucks. And it gets worse and worse. Interoception isn't like that. It can improve, it can get worse, and it can improve, and it can get worse. What we need to understand though is that when children don't have very good interoception, it impacts all kinds of things. If I can't tell that I'm in pain, what am I going to do about it? Nothing. If I'm in pain and I don't do anything about it, I can become critically ill. So there are people who we know fall off monkey bars, break their arms. They don't cry, they don't make a fuss, they go home. 3 days later it's still swollen. Oh dear. So we have to understand that it is not just about behaviour in classes that this is important. This is a really important life skill for staying alive. So for you, what you need to be sort of looking at is, okay, what when students are doing things and saying things that don't seem to match the way they present? An example of this was a little girl who the school phoned up and said to the mum, okay, you need to come take her home. She's just trashed the room. And mum got there and said, well, okay, what was happening beforehand? And said, oh, well, she was perfectly calm. She trashed the room and she was perfectly calm, and it's just not okay. She said, no, can you describe her physicality to me? And they described it. She said, but that's her really, really anxious look. So we have to be aware that, like you said, what somebody's feeling is different for somebody else, and the way that somebody presents is different than the way that somebody else presents. So in your class where you teach all this, you'll probably have a much better idea.
You have to draw from the students because it's not you can't see it. So you can't see feelings, so you have to draw it out of the students. You can't just put it in their heads.
Exactly. But unfortunately, that's not always what happens, as that example shows. If the school had known that that was her highly anxious, they would have responded to that. Because we don't get out of bed in the morning and go, let's see how many take homes we can have today. We get out of bed and say, we want to make a difference in kids' lives. I mean, I assume you do. That's what I do. And it's what I always did when I was teaching. I think we always want to do the best. If you have students on the spectrum, you'll notice that part of the sensory overview talks about what do they look like when there are various different emotions. And it might be a hypothesis initially, but it's to start signalling that thing of that it might just be a slight tension in the shoulders, and 2 seconds later everybody's going to be being decked. We need to get those really early signals. And we need the kids to start recognising their early signals too. So you can do that when they've started having that interoceptive awareness. Brilliant idea. So, Often, people will give more leeway if there's a label attached to the student. The student's on the autism spectrum, but then we tend to call it a meltdown. We don't think actually it's sympathetic nervous system overload. They're not actually thinking. We need to get it before that. If they've got lots of trauma, we might give them lots of leeway. Or alternatively, we might say, oh, they're just, perpetuating the cycle. Whereas we have to think, is it an interoceptive awareness thing, or is it a sympathetic nervous system overload due to the trauma? So anxiety is a big thing. We have lots of anxious students and kids in our schools and preschools. Now, obviously, nobody looks like this when they're anxious, because that's a cartoon. But generally, we associate anxiety with a couple of these things. You might have a couple of those things if you're ever anxious. But we have a number of students that don't ever look anxious, but whose behaviour when they become extremely anxious tips over into that sympathetic nervous system overload. So they go into survival behaviour. So one of the things that we know about anxiety is that it can also not just be about I don't know what's happening, it can also be about I'm in a lot of pain and I don't really understand what my body's feeling. I don't really understand this and it's making me quite anxious. So pictures, really good. You can have pictures of different things. At the back of your pack or in the middle of your pack there is some photographs of, you've got your baby. Look. That's in that one. There are things like a racing car, a snail, a dog on a couch. Yeah. They're called mind photos and body photos. And so children can just pick photos and say, this is what my mind, this is what my body feels like. They don't have to have emotion to it. You can get your own collection as well. The one of the dog on the couch, we had assumed meant something until a child explained that for them, the dog on the couch meant X, and it was completely different to what the school counsellor had been assuming. So we can use the photos as starts, as prompts. Drawing if the kids are good or you're good at drawing. So we need to be aware that also children don't always know they're anxious. And then the anxiety can get compounded and compounded and compounded. How do we know if somebody is in pain or if they're highly anxious or if they're being naughty? So this was an example about a child that wouldn't do anything. So about year 2 and they were just playing with Lego in the corner, would not join in. And the default position is often they're work avoidant or they're non-compliant. And my colleague who does mental health and complex needs and myself, our default position is usually, are they highly anxious? Are they so anxious that they can't do anything? Because they know if they push that anxiety a little bit more, or their experience tells them if they try and do it, they will just explode or implode. And so they just become paralysed, if you like, with fear. So how can you tell that? It's about observing. What do they look like when they're really calm? What do they look like when they are doing something? When they're playing with the Lego, will they let someone play with them? Are they always clutching their tummy? If they're always clutching their tummy, maybe they're starving. And how easy is it to work when you're starving? Maybe they have really bad constipation and they're in serious pain. And they just don't know how to explain that. So pain is a very interesting one. We talked about kids falling off munch bars and not noticing. We also have the other side of that. We have our drama queens. Okay? Now I'm allowed to say that because I am a drama queen. And the thing is that when you're a drama queen, what happens is that that sensation that occurs, that should to most people be a little owie, a minor amount of pain, registers in my sensation as the same amount of pain as an excruciating owie. So I don't feel like I'm being a drama queen. That paper cut really does hurt as much as when somebody threw a piece of metal that landed in my head. But the interesting thing about the piece of metal landing in my head was I was 12 and I had learnt by then that people don't like it when you make a fuss. So I didn't, and I just sat there until the little piece of metal, which was a big set square, fell out. And I just sat there because I had no concept that you needed to get medical attention for some areas and not for other areas. Because I just learned that people didn't like it. So we have to, instead of teaching kids not to make a fuss, you can teach them that as well, but to not make a fuss when it's a minor ailment, and how to tell the difference. When do you need to get medical attention, when do you not? If you know that children fall over all the time and never make a fuss, teach them to check themselves when there's an accident, so that we don't have kids going home with broken bones, that we don't have kids who have other issues, because sometimes they die from these. And it's not our fault, but we can help support that so it doesn't happen in the future. The other thing is that even unrecognised pain, if it goes on chronically, it's triggering that sympathetic nervous system, it's triggering survival behaviour. So if kids do have chronic pain, and we've got a number in our system that schools have really struggled with these students because their behaviour is getting worse and worse over the years. And when an intervention is being put in place, which involves a specialist GP meeting the child and the family, it turned out that for many of these kids it was chronic pain that was the issue. And when the chronic pain was treated, the behaviours went away. It's constipation untreated for years, and we treat it, the behaviour goes away. Because the sympathetic nervous system is no longer like this all the time. So for you as educators, you're looking at both hypo and hyper interoceptive awareness. We're looking at communication. Children that communicate atypically, why are they communicating atypically? When they say they're bored all the time, why are they doing that? When they're being really difficult for you all the time, is that deliberate? 99% of the time it is not deliberate. It's either to exist or it's either a sympathetic nervous system overload behaviour. It's not the answer that's hard, it's the question. The question is, do they have interoception? The question is, do they have pain that's not being picked up? Do they have a medical condition? We thought when we started our trial last year around pain and undiagnosed mental health conditions that mental health would be the driver behind most of the behaviour in children that were really challenging for the state. So we picked the most challenging kids in the state, and it turned out to be pain in most of them. And that was really surprising. So it's really something to think about. A child who was constantly pushing on his face and getting teachers to push on his face and grabbing the teachers really hard to push on his face, had chronic jaw pain. When that was treated, all the other behaviours went away. It was really very challenging. This is a really big one. Reflux is easier for the families to observe. If the child gets up in the night to eat and drink a lot, reflux doesn't hurt just after you eat and drink. It hurts again after that, and it's worse when you're lying down. We had undiagnosed diabetes in a number of children, which was very interesting. And for the pain, it was mainly around facial issues, so neuralgia, but jaw pain, tooth pain, untreated, earaches, untreated, chronic. Constipation and reflux are the biggest two. Now, if you have children that you know are living in trauma, please do not discuss this with them. We had 2 children in the state that this was discussed with, because originally when we did the training, it was all done through discussion with these children who were verbal and then through observation with non-verbal students. 2 students were seriously upset by realising they didn't have these things. It is only being children who are still living in trauma that happened to. So in order for that not to happen to anybody else, please do it through observation if you know they're living in trauma. So that tends to be children where there's lots of DCP involvement and or they're already in guardianship. So it's only 1 page of A4, it's not huge, and it's looking at just some key areas. To date when achieved, you don't necessarily do this for everybody in the class, you might just do this for a couple of students. Internal signals that tell me. So when you're doing this originally as a screening tool, and you've got your highly traumatized children, you're not asking them those questions, internal signal that tells me. You're looking at, are they wearing a sweater at 40 degrees? Are they wearing a t-shirt when it's 2 degrees? Are they drinking? If they're not drinking, they don't have a sense of thirst. If they're not eating, they don't have that sense of hunger. So you're not actually asking those questions initially to get the internal signals. However, when they're starting to develop their interoception, you can be saying to them, if they say, I'm cold, how do you know you're cold? I need to go to the toilet, obviously after they've gone. How did you know you needed to go? And this is an interesting one because our high school students initially got quite offended by this question. But you explain that the tracking sheet is used for everyone from kindy to high school. And that it's not about do you know when you need to go, it's about do you know when you're going to need to go. And for some young people that is a revelation. Other people know beforehand, and then you know that they don't. Does that make sense? The last column is the most important. How do I respond to this in a helpful way? Because if I don't know what to do about it, I'm not going to do anything. So say I've never had a sense of thirst, and I just magically develop a sense of thirst. Well, how do I know what to do with that? Because homeostasis, as we develop those skills when we're little, Mum says you're thirsty, have a drink. So you learn, this is my thirsty, and then I have a drink, and then that thirsty has gone and I feel better. Your granddaughter, who's learned to not drink, is destroying her sense of thirst. So she won't know that that's what you're meant to do. So the helpful way I can respond to this is really important. It's not obvious for people. At the back there are some letters from a special class and a kindy, and it's about interoception, and one of them says have a drink when you're hot, something. They didn't know that before. So even though it sounds obvious, it's actually a really important skill. So it's not just a problem about having a lack of awareness of thirst to hunger. As you said, it leads to dehydration. The problem with dehydration is it can cause constipation or compound constipation if a child is already constipated. And these will always lead, in the end, to either internalising or externalising behaviours, including agitation and aggression. So it might be that they internalise everything and they just become quieter and quieter, but if they're externalisers, it looks like agitation and aggression. And this is because, don't worry, Pooh is the next slide. If you are dehydrated, your brain cannot optimally learn, so your brain is just going to keep your body ticking over. So what we did was we introduced some urine charts. That it is one in your pack, doesn't look like this, it's one in your pack, and on a USB. Some of our special classes decided that they felt there was a lot of language involved in interoception, so they didn't want to do it, and they just wanted to do urine charts. So all they did was talk about the colour and smell of wee. Now, how many of you know that kids always look? They all look, don't they? They go to the toilet and they all look. Now, when they're toddlers, we think this is really cute. And when they're 16, we don't think it's really cute. However, It's really good, because if you don't have a sense of thirst, you can still self-regulate in terms of achieving homeostasis with your water intake just through your urine. When we start doing this, what colour do kids think we should be? Yes, dark. And what do they think we should smell like? Strong. And what should it smell like? Nothing. And it should be almost clear. Now there are some exceptions if you're on some particular medications. It can make it luminescent, it can make it bright orange, beetroot and asparagus. However, in general, where classes and not just special classes have introduced this, and only this has massively impacted on the children's ability to self-regulate in lots of different ways, which was interesting. 1, behaviour improved. 2, learning improved. 3, in our special classes, toilet training got easier. Now, if you think about it, if you're optimally hydrated, actually you need to go more regularly. You're going to have more of a feeling that you need to go because your bladder will get full, but also for bowel movements, you're going to not be constipated, so there's going to be more sensation. So it was really, really useful. We have had schools, mainstreams, where the whole school has done this. They've got them on the back of every single toilet door. Teachers are modelling drinking. And when kids come back from the bathroom, particularly kindies, reception year 1s, going, my wee is here. Teachers going, okay, what do you need to do about it? Go and have a drink, instead of going, don't tell me that. We're on to poos. You happy, Carol?
Yes, Sherry, thank you.
Okay, the crystal stool chart. There should be one of these on the USB too. This is really important. Unless you're in a special school with a child who is still wearing nappies, how do you know if your children and young people have constipation? When children and young people can't have a way of sharing that they have constipation or even knowing that they have constipation. So number 1 is separate hard lumps, like nuts, hard to pass. Number 2 is sausage-shaped but lumpy. Number 3 is like a sausage but with cracks on its surface. And number 4, like a sausage or snake, smooth and soft. 5 is soft blobs with clear-cut edges, pass easily. 6, fluffy pieces with ragged edges and mushy stool. And 7, watery, no solid pieces, entirely liquid. Now the important thing about this is 7 can be leakage from constipation, not just diarrhea. If your children and young people are 1 or 2 consistently, they need to get medical attention. If you have children with feces on their breath, if they get to A&E very soon, you can save their life. If they don't, they will die. Constipation kids and adults die from, and it is a horrific, horrible death. So it's really important that we don't think it's a hygiene issue. The rubber gloves is really interesting because one of the things that we get asked a lot about is poo smearing. And it is not a sensory thing for most of the kids. It is that they can't get it out, so they try and help it out. And then they have poo on their fingers, and that's disgusting. So they want to get the poo off, and it was just that the wall was right there. It's all right. 1 person has had to leave when I talk about this. However, it's really important because not all GPs take constipation seriously too. If your child's student has a GP that isn't taking it seriously, it is really important that another GP is seen because the challenging behaviour, whether it's externalising or internalising that goes with it, will get worse and worse. And the GAP service, or the Centre for Disability Health in Kennever, which collected data on challenging behaviour and conditions. And constipation was the number 1 cause of challenging behaviour for kids on the spectrum in South Australia.
Straight away when you mentioned constipation, I was thinking that's dietary related because if we see what kids are eating, there's no fibre in them.
It's kind of, but not completely. Yeah. So, with our sympathetic nervous system, when we're going to fight, flight, freeze, flop, drop, when reptile takes over, is our digestive system slows down, because that's not important. In fact, it's important we don't go to the toilet when we're running away from the bear, isn't it? Because the bear can then track us. So our young people and children who are constantly in sympathetic nervous system, whether it's here or here, their whole digestive system has slowed down. So we know there is a link between GI issues and autism, but it's actually due to partly the sympathetic nervous system. Also around, sometimes they don't have enough fibre, often there's no sense of thirst. They did research in Queensland on autism and drinking, and they found that autistic adults either overdrink water massively, or they don't drink at all, and they're seriously dehydrated all the time. Because if they're over-drinking, what they've been told is, right, drink. So they drink kind of to schedule, or because they're told to. So not drinking compounds constipation. So often they're not getting to the stage of dying because it is coming out, but it's very painful. So they've got the number one that's really painful. And then they start wanting to avoid going to the toilet too because it's painful, so then they will eat less, which makes it even worse. So there's all these things. If they have to be de-impacted by the hospital, that is also horrifically painful and quite traumatic. So then they don't want to get to that point again, at which time it's a brilliant time for education. If Bristol stool charts are a step too far for your site, you can still talk about that in order for it not to hurt, we actually have to drink water, we actually have to have a varied diet. So there are ways to do it without having the Bristol stool chart. However, is there anyone here who doesn't poo?
Kids are going to engage in the
Kids love it. And
play, make some,
if you do this, will you video it and send it in to me? Awesome. It's really important because kids often don't know that the constipation is painful. Their behaviour just changes, but it is life-threatening. I cannot stress enough how life-threatening it is. And in HPE at high school, this should be a part of it. In primary school, it can be part of the protective curriculum. The other red flag around poos and smearing and wheeze is that if kids have always been hygienically quite good and then all of a sudden they're not, that is a really good protective mechanism. People don't abuse you if you stink. So sometimes kids do this as a protective thing. It should always be a red flag, whether it's for their health or for their well-being. So that's really important. You have your hand up, we'll take your point and then we'll break from the meeting.